Warning: this episode contains details that some listeners may find disturbing. For about 60 years, a chilling story was a tight-lipped family secret. In 1962 in Rapid City, South Dakota, in the dead of night, John Bowman carried out an unthinkable act. He took the lives of his wife and two of their children before turning the gun on himself. He did not leave a suicide note, and his motives are still a mystery. Not many people in the family knew about this story until author and journalist Joe Strupp came across the tale of his great-uncle John Bowman, and Strupp spent years investigating the case, and his findings are in his new book, Death on St. Charles Street. Today, Joe Strupp joins us to talk about the book and investigating true crime. This is a study of strange. Welcome to the show. I'm Michael May, your host into, well, all sorts of strangeness. Today is a special episode because while I normally share a strange story with a guest, today I have a special guest who's going to talk to me about some strange stories. I have with me author and journalist Joe Strupp. Hi, Joe. How you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, of course. I'm very excited to have you. You've been a journalist for a long time. You've written 4 books, 2 of which kind of fit the genre of the show, which are true crime books. A Long Walk Home, which I believe is an unsolved murder. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. And your most recent book, Death on St. Charles Street, is the one I want to talk to you about mainly today, because what intrigued me is there's a bit of a family mystery behind this. And so my first question, before we get into actually what the book is about, I'd love to know about this family mystery. And if it is a mystery, how did you first hear about it? And what made you want to investigate this story?
Sure. The book is, as you said, Death on St. Charles Street. It concerns a quadruple murder suicide that occurred in 1962 in Rapid City, South Dakota, which is where my grandmother is from. My grandmother, Peggy Snyder. She was one of 6 children, and that's 3 girls and 3 boys. And one of her sisters, Alberta, was married to a man named John Bowman. They lived in Rapid City, while the rest of the siblings eventually moved away.
Mm-hmm.
So her one of her 2 sisters was married to this man. They had 3 children. And one day in 1962, he killed 2 of the children and his wife, my grandmother's sister, and himself in a multiple murder suicide. The third son was not at home. He was away at college. Otherwise, he probably would have been involved as well. And they were basically found dead in their home on a Sunday morning by 2 guests who happened to be staying over in the basement. He apparently let them live, and there was always a mystery as to why. He was not a violent man. He had never made any kind of threats. He was, however, suffering from different kinds of mental illness, depression, anxieties, some paranoia, and he had actually been in and out of a mental hospital. And I was able to actually get records from the state hospital there in South Dakota. But all this happened on a Sunday morning in 1962, and I was not even born yet. So I did not hear about it until about 20 years ago. I was at a family reunion, and my aunt was showing slides and home movies, and she was pointing out different people. You know, this was your Aunt Dorothy, this is your Uncle Morris, this is this person. And then there was one woman I had never seen, and she said, "Oh, that's your Aunt Alberta." And I said, "Oh, would I have never known her?" And she said, "No, she died before you were born."
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Oh." And then my wife actually piped up and said, "How did she die?" And the room got kind of quiet. And my aunt then said, "Well, she was murdered." And I was like,
Whoa.
the light bulb in my reporter head went off. Murdered. You know, I never had any relatives that had that kind of death. And so I started asking questions. And then over the years, I kept wanting to find out about her. And then in about 2016, I started working on my first true crime book called A Long Walk Home, which is about an unsolved murder, as you mentioned, of a 17-year-old high school student in Maplewood, New Jersey, which is where I used to live. And I started working on that, and that came out 2 years ago. Woman had been strangled, and she had just been on her way home from work, this student, and she never made it. She was last seen leaving her job at a diner, walking home, and then an hour later, her body was found strangled in a driveway about half-mile away. And there's never been any suspects, never any arrests. And I wrote extensively about that element. I also found her sister, who was only 11 at the time, who was a big part of the book.
Mm-hmm.
So I did that book, and I really enjoyed doing it. I liked looking into the criminology of it. I liked looking into the background.
Of course.
So after that was done, I said, well, let me look back at this case in my family. And so I started with newspaper clippings at the time, which were very extensive.
Mm-hmm.
And that led to information about people who knew the family. It was basically the mother and the father, my great uncle and my great aunt, the great aunt being my grandmother's sister, and their 3 children. And I was able to track down people who knew them. And also my mother and her 2 sisters had known a lot about the family. They gave me insights into the funerals and when they heard about these killings. And then I was also able to get mental health records from my great uncle at a state hospital in South Dakota. And that really helped piece it together because he had suffered from depression. He had suffered from anxiety. He had been in and out of this hospital, but he had never been violent. He had always been sort of sourful and depressed.
Right.
And it turned out his wife was an alcoholic, as was one of his children. And I
Oh,
learned a
wow.
lot of that from different relatives
Okay.
and from their friends. And so I was able to piece a lot of this together and track down a lot of information about the killings and their lives, but also about my family.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother was, as I said, one of 6 children. They grew up in really troubled times in South Dakota. That area of the country really saw the Dust Bowl
That's
long
what I was going
before
to ask. Yeah.
it really. In fact, there was a book one of the books I used for reference was called the Dust Bowl of South Dakota, which really hit about 20 years before the famed
Mm-hmm.
Oklahoma and southern states that Grapes of Wrath talks about.
Right.
And so they were living a really tough time, and it's still, while they know who killed the people, they don't necessarily know why. And so I get into a lot of theories and a lot of background about mental illness, and also talk to some criminologists and psychiatric experts who have good hypotheses about what would make this happen. And I
Right.
also learned as I went along that a lot of times we look at mental ill people who commit crimes as some kind of monster.
Mm-hmm.
That's depicted in movies, Psycho or Falling Down or some of these other. And they're really, a lot of times they're just sick. I don't think my great uncle was a bad person. I think he was dealing with a lot of demons. And
Right.
it doesn't make it okay what he did, of course, but it does help you to try to understand what drives this. It's not just
Right. And that's what I've always been curious about when it comes to true crime, because I enjoy stories like this, and I always try to emphasize to people that may get turned off by fandom around true crime. It's like my curiosity is more in storytelling, mysteries, and what drives people to do these things.
Mhm.
And that's why I think it's also important to tell these stories, because you can learn from them. And even so, let me back up a little bit. So I have some questions.
Sure.
And anything, I don't want to give away your book, so please don't go too far down a road you don't want to, because it is worth it for people to go out and buy this book and read it.
No problem.
But I am curious if John Bowman, the obviously the man who killed his wife and kids here, was he a veteran at all, from any of the wars or anything?
No, it's a good question.
Yeah.
No, I think he was kind of between the ages. He was 51 when he died in 1962.
Okay.
So during World War II, he was in his 30s,
Mm-hmm.
and probably a little young for World War I.
Yes.
And, by all accounts, he was not in the service. He was a very successful car dealer, auto salesman,
Mm-hmm.
in Rapid City, Black Hills, Oldsmobile Chrysler.
Oh, nice. I'm glad you were able to find that. That's great.
He was. In fact, I learned that the funeral homes that that handled the funeral, their hearses had been serviced at his dealership.
Oh, right.
For
That
all
would
the kind
make
of
sense.
small town craziness. I also learned that many times there were not ambulance services in Rapid City in those days. That
Right.
the local funeral home
Use the
would,
hearse. Yeah.
would use the I guess they were kind of dual vehicles.
Hmm.
They would have people on call, and I got to interview actually one of the responders who came to remove the bodies, who said they had also worked part-time at night manning the ambulances.
Wow.
And
Wow.
that was just the way it was back then. Rapid City was a major city. It still is in South Dakota.
That's what I was going to ask next. So, yeah, tell us a little bit about Rapid City, especially in 1962. Like, we always think of, I would say we, quote unquote, we people that live on, the coast or outside of the
Yes,
Midwest, we think of South Dakota as being very, very small in terms of population. So, yeah, tell us a little bit about the city itself.
very rural. It has a few major. I mean, the capital is Pierre. There are a few other big cities, but
Hmm.
Rapid City is known because it's right next to the Black Hills, where Mount Rushmore is. I had never been there until I started working on the book, and it's kind of more of the Old West. You
Hmm.
know, it's about an hour south of Deadwood, South Dakota, which is known for Wild Bill Hickok and then the TV show Deadwood.
Yes, yes.
Um, but it has a lot more Old West history and ranching than farming.
Hmm.
But it is a major city. They have their own major newspaper and TV. It's a TV market, and but even in 1962, it was not like today's big cities.
Right.
And also learned that South Dakota did not have a lot of gun-related deaths then or today.
Hmm.
I mean, I think it was less than 35 gun-related deaths, although it is big gun country.
Yeah.
There's hunting and fishing and all, but you don't see the kind of mass murders that sadly we're seeing in a lot of places. It's
Right.
a whole
Yeah.
other issue.
Violent crime. Yeah.
But my reporting found that the gun that was used to kill the family was a 22 caliber rifle that one of John Bowman's sons had gotten and had gone hunting with.
Oh, okay.
People went hunting early on. My father grew up in Minnesota. I think he started hunting when he was 10.
Hmm.
And so to have guns in the house was not unusual. Uh,
Right.
and some of the mental health records indicated John Bowman was not seen as dangerous. He was not violent. In fact, he had always been a volunteer patient. He was never ordered to go to the hospital.
Oh,
So,
that's interesting.
yeah, he
Okay.
was not.
Yeah.
That was another reason it was very surprising. He also didn't leave a suicide note of any kind, which makes investigators think it was probably something of a random uh, act of passion in the moment. There just happened to be a gun in the house, and he thought for whatever reason he had to do this.
Right. So there's a number of things that stood out to me that I find strange, which is no note, which you just talked about. The children, I think I was reading that it looked like they didn't wake up, right? Like they
Right.
were shot in their sleep. And the other strange part, and I'd love to hear about a little bit about all these things, but the other thing is the people that found the bodies, the
Yeah.
the two people living in the basement, which I also just thought was a little odd because I don't know much about it. So yeah, if you don't mind sharing your thoughts or what you found about each of those, what I
Sure.
call the strange aspects of this
Yeah,
case.
that's
Yeah.
what made the whole. As I learned more and more about it, um, I was more intrigued because it
Yeah.
just so happened that these two men, John and Tom May, who were very responsive, although John uh, was was not very talkative. I think he had also served in Vietnam after this, so he had
Okay.
two kind of traumatic issues, and he
And
didn't really
and
want to
wait,
talk.
their last name was May?
Fay,
Oh,
Fay.
Fay. Okay, I was gonna say maybe they're distant relatives of mine, but I guess not.
No, no,
Yeah.
John and Tom Fay. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But Tom was very helpful. They were friends who were visiting. They actually knew the family from Canton, Minnesota,
Mm.
which is where my grandmother and grandfather ended up living with other siblings. My grandmother, Peggy, who was Alberta's sister, she married my grandfather, who was from Canton. And interestingly, another sister of theirs, Dorothy, married my grandfather's brother. So you had two sisters marrying two brothers, which was probably not all that unusual back then. But they ran this nursery in Canton, which is about 600 miles from Rapid City. But they would go all over the Midwest to sell their wares.
Okay.
And one of the stops that his brother Searle was the one married to Grandma's sister. He would go to South Dakota to sell trees and shrubs and things, and that's where he met Dorothy. And then Dorothy brought her sister, my grandmother Peggy, back to Minnesota, and so they really built their life. And my mother and her sisters all grew up partially in Minnesota, but so they knew these two men, Tom and John Fay, and they knew the family, so they were visiting Rapid City. I think one of them was even working out there.
Mm-hmm.
So they just happened to be staying overnight in the basement. And they woke up in the morning expecting to go to church with everyone and found the bodies.
And they didn't hear gunshots?
They claim, and in the book I talk about, they didn't hear gunshots. They claim that they heard some kind of thump
Okay.
in the night. And one of the criminologists I talked to said that might not be unusual because it was a rifle.
Right.
It was a 22 caliber rifle. And they said that sometimes if you put a gun right against someone's head, it muffles the sound.
So a little bit like a natural silencer, which sounds
That was the
terrible to
theory.
say. Yeah. Yeah.
One of the problems, although I don't think it really affected me, was there were no police records.
Oh.
Because Rapid City years later had a terrible flood.
Oh.
It flooded out police department and many other buildings. And at a time when, you didn't have the Google Cloud to upload documents or other
Exactly.
technology of the day. So
Yeah.
reports were all, but it was interesting because the newspaper clippings of the time really filled in a lot of the holes.
Mm-hmm.
And also recollections of people. Like I interviewed both as I said, the funeral home employee who helped bring the bodies away, and the priest who responded to give last rites. And he was an interesting character. He had just become a priest 2 months earlier, and he was serving mass that morning because it was a Sunday morning. And when the police responded, they had these 4 dead bodies. They needed someone to perform last rites, so they called the church, and whoever answered the phone basically literally went up to the priest during the service and said, "Look, we need someone to go give last rites." And he left, and another priest had to finish the service.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me his descriptions of what he found. One of the bodies, I believe it was Maurice, the youngest son. It looked like he'd been shot under the chin and had a very clean wound. Where Bruce, the other son, he seemed like he had thrashed around because there was blood on the walls and all over, not to get too graphic.
Yeah. Yeah.
He probably didn't die right away.
Oh, yeah.
But it wasn't clear if he was shot from far away or not,
Got it.
Plus, it was, let's see, 60 years ago. Tom Fay may have not realized what he had heard a noise, but he didn't. Plus, I don't know. You hear a shot, maybe you're sort of half awake. However, 4 shots, that's still a lot.
Yeah, it's an odd aspect of the case that stood out to me for sure. And not that I obviously have any answers to it, but it is interesting about the idea of the muzzle perhaps being silenced by, direct contact. But it is an odd aspect to the case for sure. So also no suicide note, which I know you talked a little bit about, and that this could have been a spur of the moment thing. But in any of your research, you had mentioned John Bowman was never violent or anything like that. But did you come across anything that may have, I guess, helped that theory that this may have been like a spur of the moment killing?
Only that one of the things I found was, again, in all the psychiatric records, which were very detailed, he was generally seen as depressed,
Mm-hmm.
anxiety ridden. But in both cases, he had been in the Yankton State Hospital, which I think has a different name now, twice. The year before for about 4 months, and then that same year, 1962, the killings happened July 29th, He had been in the hospital for a couple of weeks in the spring, gotten out in May, but he had already uh, started separation efforts from his wife. He was still living in Yankton. He had actually lived with another woman for a while in his
Oh,
own
okay.
business. So it's also thinking, he was kind of getting a new life.
Yeah.
So why would he pull this? Although he was still dealing with financial problems, he had been a very successful car salesman. And as I go through in the book, the auto industry was having some ups and downs. Right after, during World War II, they shut down a lot because the auto plants had to be used for the war. But then afterwards, there was a big boom in car sales
Yes,
in
yes.
52, 53, and he was doing very well. But then he was still having his own issues, it seems from the records, because of anxiety, because I think a lot of pressures. You have to keep making money as a salesman, and his wife and one of his sons were alcoholics. So that's another thing that comes about.
Yeah,
You have a
yeah.
lot of angst in the family, a lot of stress. He had gone to a mental hospital years earlier. He had gone to the Mayo Clinic, which is
Oh,
obviously in Minnesota,
yeah.
briefly, and had gotten out of there. He'd always gotten these good marks. It's okay. He's okay to leave.
Well, it's also interesting that he was voluntarily doing this. That
Yes,
shows some self-awareness that
yes, and
he
I thought
needs help.
very very unusual for that time, especially for
Yeah,
a man. In the
yeah.
Midwest, men are supposed to be tough, macho. The stigma of mental illness it's still not great today, but even back then worse.
Mhm.
So the fact that he was willing to do that, and he seemed very lucid, and by according to the reports, and was getting better. But some of the experts I talked to theorized that you know what was going on in his head was still maybe guilt, because his marriage was breaking up,
Right.
and he didn't feel like he was making the money for his family, perhaps, and embarrassed. And as the 50s went along, he started to do worse and worse at work, and he ended up leaving his job. And that's a lot for a lot of men to take, and again, especially back then in that area.
Mhm.
And so a lot of this was going through his head. And like I said, he was in the hospital just months earlier. And the treatment at the time, I'm sure, wasn't what it is today,
Oh, of course not. Yeah,
medically, in terms of medications or even therapy, and the acceptance. So
exactly.
it's a
Yeah.
lot of mixed bag. And then you have a wife who's alcoholic. One of the kids is having trouble. It's a
So
lot swirling around.
so the one son who survived because he was away at college,
Yeah,
did he ever say, and I believe he passed away, right, in, like, 2011? I did a little
2001,
2001.
just a week before 9/11.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
Did he ever mention anything? Did you ever find out any of your research? Did he talk to family members,
yeah. He
newspapers,
was
anything?
actually my mother's cousin,
Mhm.
about her age, and also my aunts. And they said a lot of people talked about right after the deaths, he had to kind of help plan the funeral, and that he was very, very matter of fact, very stoic, very kind of focused on his task at hand. He stayed with one of the friends I talked to, and said he was just very, he wasn't wallowing in pity in the corner, but he wasn't, throwing a party either. He was just sort of even keel, focused on what he had to do.
Yeah, and did
Years
he
later,
ever
go ahead.
sorry, oh, I was gonna ask, and you were probably going to this yourself, but did he ever add anything to the story? Did he have his own theories or thoughts or
Not that I
anything?
ever learned.
Got
No,
it.
I don't think a lot of people wanted to talk. A lot of people in my family didn't talk about this at all for
Yeah.
years. I mean, and it took my nosiness, I guess, to. But then I learned in talking to a lot of family members, they really were curious about it. It's not like I was wondering if, well, do they want me to go down this road as I started research? And if they had come to look, we don't want to talk about it. It's family history. Keep it where it is. That would have been interesting to probably made it more difficult. But they were all very open. My cousins, my uncles and aunts, and friends who knew the family were very, I guess, wanting to kind of talk. No one had talked about it for 50 years, 60 years.
Yeah, yeah. I would think the time passing, that much time, I think allows the family because now you have future generations that wanna know more, so I think the curiosity
And
finally
I wanted
opens
to
up.
know more.
Yeah, exactly. So I think
Felt
that
it. I
secret
was
thing opens.
a lot of times I do books because I want to learn about the stuff.
Exactly, yeah.
And it was very helpful though that they were willing to. And then he went on. He actually went on and graduated college. He went and eventually became an airline pilot. So he was doing pretty well for years. And then in I guess the 90s, he kind of fell out of touch, and he was actually living on the street for a while. I think when he
Oh, wow.
died, his last known address was some kind of halfway house
Oh,
or a homeless place in California. And when he died, I think my grandmother and my aunt were very involved in transporting his body back, and he's buried right there in the cemetery in Rapid City next to his brothers
oh,
and his
good.
parents. Yeah,
Good.
they're all in the same cemetery, as though they were put there at the same time.
Well, great. So, I'm going to ask you a couple other things before we go, but do you have any final thoughts or information you want to share about this story? And obviously, I'm going to share where people can buy the book in the show notes and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, is
Sure.
there any other sort of final thoughts you had on this?
Well, I just think it's if you like true crime, I think it's a great true crime story because it involves mental illness and some mystery as to why this happened. But also, I try to look into this idea that um, a mentally ill person isn't some kind of monster of
Right.
evil. You
Right.
like I said before, you hear about in movies, and you realize sometimes these are just sick people. I don't think my great uncle, was a bad person or evil. I think he was sick. He suffered from depression and anxieties, and he went over the edge. Does that make him guilt free? No. What he did was still a horrible thing, and it always will be. But I think to understand what brings you to this kind of a tragedy is a way to prevent it in the future, and also to understand, these are all people. This can happen to anyone. Anyone can deal with any kind of emotional issue, whether it's depression or anxiety or paranoia or drug addiction, or it all stems from emotions. And maybe the other cautionary tale is, you know, if someone is dealing with this, get them the help. He got help at the time, but it was 1962. How good was mental health treatment? It sounds like it was better than I would have thought, because there was medication he was on, there was treatment, there was therapy. And then some of the experts I talked to in the book also point out, you know what, today you don't always have all the answers either.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
As we know, there's shooting sprees that go on. People have mental illness. So you kind of have to look at this as a victim in their own right in some ways, and as a troubled person, not just some evil monster that just wants to kill.
Well said. And before we wrap up here, I'm curious because I love research. That's what I've kind of discovered as my life has gone on, that I love the process of researching. And it's fed a lot of my professional and creative life over the last handful of years. And I'm curious, as a journalist, and especially with like A Long Walk Home, your other true crime book, The Unsolved Murder you mentioned earlier, because that one has no suspect and has never been solved. What is the process you go through as an investigative journalist to try to figure those things out? Like, where do you start? Where do you go?
Well, the thing about the in A Long Walk Home, there have been no official arrests, but there are some suspects that I go through in the book,
Oh, okay.
and I do. In the end, I do point to one person I think is the most likely suspect.
Ooh.
A man who had worked just across the street from where the girl Carol Ann Farino was last seen, and who years later was actually arrested and tried for another murder of a young woman, but he was acquitted on that case.
Hmm.
But there are a lot of reasons why he's probably the most likely suspect.
Sure.
And also some other suspects in New Jersey. I learned that in New Jersey, we have quite a history of multiple murderers who prey on young women. It's really there's one man, Richard Cottingham, who was also one of my suspects. He has, in recent years, admitted to killing, I think it's up to 15 women over a 20-year span, and several others. So it's kind of a frighteningly long list of
Yeah.
young, attractive women being murdered by multiple killing men. But that is unsolved in terms of no one has ever been arrested or convicted of it.
Right. Right.
But and then in this case, I don't know, the way I approach it is, I've been a reporter for 35 years. I've covered a lot of different kinds of things, including crime. I just start with the basics. Um, in the case of Caroline Farino, I was able to get police reports, although we're still actually in a legal battle with Maplewood Police Department in New Jersey and the Essex County Prosecutor's Office to get more access. There's apparently a large folder of information on Carol's case that they will not release,
Oh,
even
wow.
though the case is more than 50 years old and nothing's been done on it. And her sister, who's still alive, who was a big part of the book, and I have been trying to get access to these records that we were promised access to at one point, and then the county prosecutor's office in New Jersey, we don't have district attorneys. They call them county prosecutors.
Okay.
In New Jersey, the county prosecutor's office in each county basically has jurisdiction over all serious crimes. So they came in and said, no, you can't have access. I filed public information requests. They've been denied. We're in touch with a lawyer. So that we think there's a lot in there that will paint a picture of what really happened and how the police in Maplewood really botched much of the case because they seemed to focus on people she knew and her family, including her father, who had a very clear alibi. And they didn't really look into the fact that it could have been a stranger, someone she didn't know, because she worked in this diner at night in a very busy part of town where they got a lot of night crawlers, if you will, a lot of cab drivers, and right across from the train station. So people come in and out of the train. They never went down that road. And I think a lot of criminologists I've talked to and her sister believe that they missed their chance and that it was more likely someone she didn't know rather than someone she did know. But in the case, I basically started with that I could get the few police reports I could get, and then talked to her sister. And then her sister knew a lot of people who knew her, who knew Carol. And then I went on some Facebook pages, and Facebook had a few pages, as many towns have, growing up in this town. So there's a couple Facebook pages, people who've lived in South Orange and Maplewood. They're kind of sister towns.
Yeah.
They share a school district. And so I went on a couple of those Facebook pages and just said, hey, I'm working on this case. And I just got flooded with people. Oh, I knew Carol, or I remember this and I remember that. And I asked her sister about, did she know these people? And she said, oh, yeah, this guy was her friend. And even her boyfriend at the time came through. And they all had all kinds of memories of what happened that night.
Yeah.
One girl had a party that night, and members of police coming the next day asking questions. And that led to even more people who had information. And it really painted a good picture of what happened leading up to, and then the years that followed, how the police didn't really, kept trying to find out and really didn't follow the right leads. And then I kind of do a story, also the side story on her sister. Her sister, grew up with this hanging over her head. She got married young and got divorced, and then she moved out to the Midwest and had all kinds of her own demons and issues because, her only sister was killed when she was 11 years old. And she was asked by her mother, after a while, her sister had left this diner, Milt's Cup and Saucer in downtown Maplewood. At about 7:30, she was last seen a little before 8 walking home. And when she didn't get home, around 8:30, her mother said, wake your father up to go look for her, because the father was sleeping. He had been a newspaper delivery guy, so he worked early hours.
Right.
He'd come home and take a nap, so he's sleeping. The sister, Cynthia, went to wake him up. He went out to look for her. And then at some point, the sister fell asleep on the couch. And she said she was woken up at about, between 11 and midnight by a policeman who essentially told her, yeah, your sister was killed. When you write a book, you can kind of take it wherever you want.
Right.
Which I really like, because I go off into some side stories. It's not just, oh, here's this terrible crime. It's, backstory on this person, on this time, in this year, in this town, what it was like. And I was able to do a lot of that in both books. And in The Long Walk Home, I'm sorry, in Death on St. Charles Street, I started with newspaper clippings at the time. And back then, the stories on funerals would often list all the pallbearers. And
Right.
you had
Yes.
four
Yes.
people buried in this funeral. So that's six pallbearers each.
That's a lot of pallbearers. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I just started tracking them down. And, the internet is a great source for tracking down phone numbers, and
Hmm.
started calling one and then another and another. And that led to another person who knew this person. Everyone very responsive. And then I got the state hospital records, which helped fill in some holes. And then a lot of my relatives who not only talked about the killings and what happened, but just the family at the time and growing up in South Dakota, which, was a very poor area. And it really welled around nicely. In fact, one of my great aunts, my great aunt Dolores Connolly, who they call Jigs, she just died last year at, I think, 104.
Oh, wow.
She had lived next door. Her and her husband had lived next door to the Bowmans prior to the killings. So she
Mm.
had great insight into what the couple was like. And she, like everyone, painted a picture of him as a very quiet, nice man who never caused any trouble. And
Yeah.
bang, here's this terrible ending.
Well, on that note, Joe, thank you so much for being on the show. Before you go, where can people find you? Where do you want people to go to find the books? Obviously, I'll provide links and show notes as well. But yeah, where can people find your work?
It's available at Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com, and any bookstore can order it if you want people to order it. Some of these bookstores, I'm in New Jersey, so if someone wants to get one and have me sign it, or I only have a few copies to sell. You can get information on me at my website, joestrupp.com. But a lot of times, bookstores around New Jersey, you can order from them if you don't want to necessarily pad the Amazon pockets.
Amazon. Yep.
A lot of local bookstores. Call your favorite bookstore, and they'll order it.
Do it. Support bookstores, everybody. I love that you're saying that. Yeah.
Find a way to sign it if you want. So it's available anywhere that any other book is available.
Nice.
Online or in person. Just ask them to order it or get it on Amazon. And you can also download the e-copy if you're all about the Kindle, which I am too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate you coming on. Both these stories are fascinating, and I can't wait to actually read them both in their entirety. So thank you so much for doing this, and I will talk to you soon.
Thank you so much. Stay safe.
Thank you for listening. That'll do it for the show. Before you go, take a quick second to subscribe, and please leave a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want additional content or know of different ways to support the podcast, visit our website, astudyofstrange.com. We will be off next week, but back soon after that. Thank you, and good night.